Hi, everybody. Welcome to the QB School. I'm JT O'Sullivan. Today, very special edition. Book review, Finding the Winning Edge by Bill Walsh, the head coach's Bible. We're diving into it, going front to back, all over the place, bunch of examples. Think you are going to love this video. Let's dive into it. Welcome to the QB School. If you dig this kind of content and you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, get the notifications, let you know when we go live, when we put out new content. I really appreciate the support for the channel. So, as mentioned earlier, this video has been a long time coming. And what I mean by that is this is a very special book for me on a bunch of different reasons. But I'm really excited to dive into this thing. We're going to kind of go comprehensive. I'm going to pull some pages out, show some examples, really dig into what I think are the best elements of the book, and just kind of talk through exactly what this thing means and what it means for a lot of people in the football community, especially at the league level. And so first off, Bill Walsh, growing up on the West Coast, was a hero to many football fans, maybe not even on the West Coast, across the country, but essentially the godfather, the creator of the West Coast offense. And so it, from jump, has some credibility with just the author. From there, though, I think it really goes and takes on a life of its own for me personally. This book, the inside cover, my dad gave to me in 1998, so well over 20 years ago, dedicated it. He died in 2004, so it's been a long time. So really cool, mixed emotions about diving back into this thing just because I remember where it came from. And books for me are always a bit of a time warp. And what I mean by that is they are simply a snapshot of when they are created by that author. And so the idea being that you're going to walk back into the 90s in essentially the leading mind, almost like a savant-ish type icon in the football world with the West Coast offense, a California kid in California, those type of things, mixed emotions of my dad kind of giving me a little dedication to the front of it. So very cool on a number of different levels, but really special at the same time too. And so I haven't picked this thing up in well over 15 years. The idea of what the things were that still resonate with me that I use kind of subconsciously all the time, even when I'm still talking about footwork, quarterback, anticipation, accuracy, all those things. I know exactly where they come from. They come from this book. And so there are some elements that resonated with me years afterwards. But there are also some elements of the book that I think fall well short, and we'll dive into it because I think it's important to talk about the kind of holistic review of it. But to say that this book isn't iconic on most coaches' shelves, and I'm not sure if most have read it cover to cover, but the idea being that there is probably no better head coach's manual or textbook than this book. It is that comprehensive. In fact, I think a potential criticism could be that it's too comprehensive, too heavy to read, too chunky on a bunch of different levels, and almost too detail-oriented to the point where you think that you can kind of see why and how a coach could get burnt out pretty quickly if this was all registering in their mind. And this is essentially, to a certain extent, an element of just kind of a mind dump as far as everything that's in a head coach's mind at the NFL level, from the details and kind of nuance of play structure, of creating a system, of organization, all the way down to executive assistants' job duties. So you can see the span there as probably maybe a bit too much to get into one text. But that, I don't want to shortchange what this thing is. This thing is special on a number of different levels. I think the best kind of areas that we'll talk about here, game planning, installing an offense, developing a quarterback, and really kind of how all those things fit together. And then, to be honest with you, going back through it, one of my favorite parts of this book, which probably does a decent job of giving an evaluation of the pros and how this thing flows together, is the appendix. The appendices are amazing. They are some of my favorite parts, talking about how he constructed some of his lectures to the organization, to some of the most iconic football plays in the history of football. Either way, I'm excited. Let's dive into this thing. First things first. So one of my favorite elements of the book was just being able to peek through what an NFL schedule is like. And I remember reading this book in college, so I didn't know at the time, but this was identical to my experience throughout most of the league. And I put on here today just Friday and Saturday, the idea being you can show a little bit more because these are the shorter days. This idea being that you come in, meetings, quarterback meetings specifically, meetings, install, go over the practice, eat, lunch. You know, it is a typical work week. and it is scheduled out to the minute every single day that you're in the facility. And really all this is from the genesis of the head coach. So really cool to be able to see exactly what it's like and be reaffirmed from someone who played that this is exactly what we did all the time. And so it's really a great blueprint for kind of the logistics, the scheduling, the game week, those type of things. If you don't have access, if you didn't play in the league, you can go in here and get a firsthand knowledge to get a blueprint to how these kind of weeks are constructed. So not only do they do a great job of showing how the day is constructed, he also goes in and shows exactly how a practice is constructed. So you can see the different time segments, you can see when people are out on the field, how they're practicing, what the practice structure looks like. And again, I don't think this is necessarily revolutionary to many people, but if you didn't play at this level, or you didn't play at a high level, and you wonder how some of these practices are constructed and run off timers and scoreboards, those type of things, to be able to better, either whether you're a coach and you want to know how you can maybe be a little bit more efficient in your practice time, a lot of it is this preparation to play and practice, and how these things just come down to how we want to do things, whether it's a mock game and we're going to do situational football, move the ball, 3 reps here, 3 reps there, those types of things, to be able to get better prepared for the game as you get closer and closer to that game time. But how these things are really specific, doesn't happen by accident. It's not just kind of off the cuff on the field. These are things are blueprinted out, kind of templates that just about every coach uses, especially at the highest levels. Another section that I really liked was the game planning. People ask me all the time about how kind of NFL play call sheets are organized, so much so that we have a video on the channel that goes over it. But I thought this was an interesting one, because most people usually only think of the normal D&D stuff, the normal down and distance stuff, first down, second down, third down calls, those types of things. Well, in reality, those sheets are so big because they have a bunch of different situations boxed in there. And so you can see here whether it's different attacking fronts, different sub fronts, different potential adjustments at halftime, backed up, all sorts of different ways to be able to have plays ready. Now, I think you could also see this bleeding into potentially almost over preparation, to the point where how much time are you changing this? How much is this changing every single week? Those type of things that I think, are worth talking about, just because of what this book meant and how, when and where he wrote this book. As a former coach, someone who he was often quoted as saying he retired too early, and I think is well documented that he was kind of borderline upset that the 49ers won without him, with Coach Seifert as the head coach, and a really good team in the early 90s or late 80s, early 90s, and those types of things that you can see the burnout potentially, for me, start to trickle in with some of this, what I'm going to classify as over preparation, which is still prevalent in many levels of football, where you're sleeping at the office, you're spending time at the office. It's a time stamp to be able to say, hey, I was at the office till 2 in the morning going over the last 4 plays of the game, which don't change the entire year. So those type of things that I think the details and nuance and like really granular stuff that goes over in this book at just about every single chapter, every single section, which for me, you can start to see kind of contextualized in these types of situational awareness. Yes, absolutely, you need to have situational awareness. Yes, absolutely, it helps to have practice every single situation. But at the same time, you can't practice every single situation. You have to have good, strong core principles of how you operate as an offense or defensive unit, and rely on those things in crunch time. But I think this does show at the league level how detailed, how obsessive some of these coaches are in that preparation and that element, and what makes them great. But the back end of that is you probably get burned out really quickly too. And so, this is essentially a kind of legacy memoir to the football world of how one of the most brilliant guys ever to do it did it, and maybe why he wasn't coaching when he wrote it, because he was so burnt out. So there's this tension in kind of the material that I thought was fascinating, that I probably didn't get when I first read it, as I was just reading it as kind of a checklist to better understand ball. We're now going back and unpacking and understanding exactly where he was in his life. It really makes the book richer for me, and I enjoyed it more, more recently than I remember enjoying it when I first read it, in college. Now let's talk about what I think is the absolute premier section in this book. It is the quarterback development section. He goes into talking about how to develop every single position player on a team, but by far the most detailed, by far what I think is the best section, is how to develop a quarterback, and it is really comprehensive. It goes from classroom to teaching to practice field to game sideline to communication, to everything. And one of my favorite sections, because this is back in the day when I necessarily hadn't done all of these things really well, started to get introduced to 7-step drops in college, but you don't really major in 7-step drops back in the early 90s for me in college. And so the idea of being able to see the level of detail that went into every single drop. And so if I could translate this to young players, the idea being that, yeah, the drops have evolved. There are different ways to do, what I'm used to calling hybrid drops or shuffle drops or gun stuff. Gun footwork has changed a little bit, obviously. But the level of detail from understanding quarterbacking from the ground up, Bill Walsh was talking about it in the 90s, in the 80s probably. So those types of universal principles for me are some of the best elements about it. And I think it's fascinating to essentially have a conversation with one of the most brilliant quarterback minds in the history of football, is what you're doing in this book. But specifically, if you love quarterback play, this section is by far the premier section for me in this book. And I wish I could copy it, make a PDF and make it available to everybody so you didn't have to go buy what I thought were ridiculously high used book prices. But if you can get your hands on that section, I highly recommend it. Probably the best prose, literature, article, short chapter I've seen on a comprehensive take on how best to develop quarterbacks. And I really try to implement it, not only through this channel, but through coaching younger players and all of those things. And it's really does a great job of being able to show where it was, how it was done at a really high level in the 90s. And you can see how some of the things that he predicted have come true, whether it's tempo and offense, one-word calls, all those things about development of what the quarterback can handle, better understanding accuracy, decision-making, anticipation, all the things, buzzwords we hear about nowadays, Bill Walsh wrote about in the 90s. Another section that I really enjoyed, and probably because I used to go to 49er training camp at Sierra Junior College or Community College, this idea being the 49ers kind of training camp plan. So what does an install look like when you're installing the offense at training camp? Because nowadays you hear guys say like, we install our offense in 5 days, in 3 days. And I kind of chuckle at that. I don't know, for a bunch of different reasons. One, that you put like an artificial time boundary on something like that you don't have to. And the fact that, the volume of what it's like in the league can be a lot. If you're not used to it, or maybe if you're lacking a little bit of attention or your capacity, those types of things. So it's really fun for me to be able to see back in the day, how exactly did they install it? Because a lot of these terms I'm mildly familiar with just from being a part of the West Coast offenses, a bunch of different spots. But I thought this was a great example of how they install it, maybe their first couple days in camp, and just see the volume of it. So you can see, we're Monday, July 18th. They got a little just what the practice schedule looks like. It's really, pretty simple. 2 practices, a night meeting, the things that I remember seeing the team do at Sierra College. And so it's really fun for me to see exactly how they do it, how they break down the practices. You see the different time groups, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, whatever. All those things are interesting, but I would imagine that's how most teams do it. You see a night off, those types of things. This is how they do it in the NFL. But the really interesting part for me was to see how the offense is installed. So you can see here, day 1 installation, that looks pretty large. I would say that's pretty large compared to what most people are used to doing nowadays. I get it, it's the league, but you see a protection, 376, you see those are pass concepts, halfback read. I'm looking at just day 1. Z in, double comeback, deep over, jet X slant, that's spacing, wide cross fullback fan. That's Texas, wide cross fullback curl. That's Texas with an out. You see these 50, 54, 55 different protection, razor, really famous, audible, all these things, and then a handful of different runs. And that's every day, right? I mean, look across the week, that's 6 days. And that's what it looks like to install an NFL offense. And that's just the offense on the top. You can see underneath, already they're into a bunch of different nickel calls, nickel packages in week 1 of an NFL preseason camp. And so it's fascinating for me when people get kind of lumped into, and I get it, there is a beautiful element of simplicity, but I also think that there's an element of just understanding where football has evolved, even if you are on the far side of the simple train as far as what you like to do offensively or defensively. I think it's interesting to see, what teams can handle. Obviously at the league is a different level, but this idea being, I think it's interesting to learn the process of how other teams have done it, how maybe one of the best offensive minds ever did it. And so it's not just one cookie cutter way. It's having that organizational fit, program fit to match how you install and how thoughtful these installations are. It's not just kind of ad hoc, we're going to do this day and we'll try this. We'll be a trap this day and inside zone this day. Like, there's an element to do a lot of different things. And if you're really intentional with how you teach and educate and practice those things, from both the meetings, the installations, to on the field, you can really, essentially change football. Is what Bill Walsh did with the advent of the West Coast passing game and kind of the short, intermediate timing, accuracy, all those things that I think still resonate in the game now are just called different things. So one example from the appendix session that I really loved is, and I think most people remember this, throwing the Montana to Taylor back at the end zone to beat the Bengals. I want to say this is the drive that Joe Montana famously pointed out John Candy in the crowd. But essentially, to me, I've never seen this play drawn up. I don't remember seeing this when I first looked at the book. But to me, this is just Texas nod. It could easily just be Y stick too with a little fan route. But I love the way that he talks about the coverage. They thought he was doubling the outside wide receivers. So it's nice when you can motion the greatest of all time wide receiver. And I love Randy Moss, but Jerry Rice across the field and run him on a decoy route to come in there and then run a double move, in the red area. Really beautiful concept. You can see kind of the high-low of what that Texas or fan route with the back looks like. Another pretty good player in Roger Craig to John Taylor on the back line with a nice little double move with the stick nod there. So really cool to hear his words, how he described it. It's a lot going on with the drawing and the names, but all those things. Again, this is the end of the book. There's a bunch of plays like this. He talks about different concepts, breaks them down like this. So really a treat, especially at the end of a 500+ page book, to be able to get this level of detail on so many great classic NFL plays. So in short, in the end, I have mixed emotions about this book. I connect emotionally on a bunch of different levels to it. I do love the level of detail, the comprehensive attempt at what this book is, and which is essentially a blueprint to every football head coach. I do think, though, that I'd be not being totally honest if I told you it was the easiest read in the world. I would say it would be a real struggle to go cover to cover here with this read. But as far as almost operating as kind of a encyclopedia, as a time warp word there, as far as what you need to know to give yourself the best chance to be successful as a head coach, I think it would be hard to find a better book than this. I think you can start to see some of the potential pitfalls as far as over-detailed, over-nuanced, too much information, which can bleed in really quickly. And kind of, to be honest with you, it kind of reminds me of trying to read an NFL playbook, where there's almost too much information to be able to be usable on a Sunday. And I get it that playbooks serve different uses for different positions and different coaches and all those things. And if you're looking to have kind of one kind of mind dump as far as what it looks like and what you would love to have kind of working in your head as far as a coach, an NFL head coach, or just any head coach, I think it'd be really cool to say that this book is definitely influential in that space. But at the same time, I think you're probably missing it a little bit if you think you're just going to sit in the beach and read this thing cover to cover. There are so many bullets and dashes that, for me, it kind of, the analogy that I like to use is it's kind of like trying to read while whitewater rafting. Everything is chunk, 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 so much so that there is almost an overuse of, I know coaches love to quote other people, and especially war quotes. And I know we're in a sensitive time when it comes to those types of things. But for someone who's always kind of shied away from the war analogy with football, to me, it's distracting. And so I get it. In the 90s, it might have been different. Again, one of the reasons why I love books in general, they are time warps. But the overquotes, the bullets, the dashes makes it really tough to read. It's definitely not smooth or easy. But as far as just the overarching comprehensive amount of information that's available in this book, it really is second to none. And if you're serious about ball and you're serious about trying to become a head coach, you probably can't get it recommended to you enough. So hopefully you enjoyed the book review. Normally I would put a link in the description to, have you go buy it somewhere, but I couldn't find it for somewhere that, wasn't either like a couple cents or hundreds of dollars. So maybe check out your local library and enjoy the read. So thank you so much for checking out the channel, supporting the channel. Do me a favor, you made it this far, please check the link in the video description. Check out the RPO course. I can't recommend it enough. It's not quite as good as this or as deep as this, but I think that there are elements as far as the detail that if you love this kind of book, you would love the RPO course as far as better understanding RPOs. So thank you so much, and I will see you next time. Have a good one.